Welcome back to the illumilands. My name is Daniel Hurd, and in this video, I'll be beginning a response to Cameron Bertuzzi over at Capturing Christianity and Stephen Woodford over at Rationality Rules. They semi-recently, had a debate over the Kalam Cosmological Argument, and specifically Cameron Bertuzzi's own personal version of the Kalam. So, if you guys enjoy this first episode, let me know. That tells me to make another. Before getting into the meat of the video, I want to note one thing. These videos are free to watch, but you know what's not free? Making them. Also, living. If you check out my videos, including this one, you like what you see, and you want to see more videos in the future, subscribe and consider heading over to my Patreon and supporting the channel there. Those joining the middle and upper tier subscriptions get sweet perks like early access to videos, access to my own Kalam debate map, and access to my personal website, which contains more writings on God and philosophy that I've written throughout the years. And with that said, let's get into the video.
I think it's important at the outset of this series to point out some of the historical inaccuracies that Stephen has made in his previous work on the Kalam Cosmological Argument.
So, Cameron starts the video in a way that seems a bit strange to me. He spends the first 5 minutes critiquing Stephen's overview of the history of the traditional Kalam, despite right after this presenting his own unique version of the Kalam. Now, from my point of view, if you're having a debate about the soundness of an argument, the history of that argument is only relevant if it bears on the argument's soundness. Cameron's rationale behind this is that
I hope that it will convince Stephen to be a little bit more precise in the future. I think that he and I can both agree that precision is very, very important.
Fair enough, but it's still a bit odd. I can only imagine that Stephen was thinking, I haven't even said anything in this debate, and Cameron's faulting me for not being precise on a matter that doesn't bear on the soundness of the argument at hand. To be fair to Cameron, he's not wrong that Stephen had some inaccuracies when explaining the Kalam's history, as Stephen himself later concedes. And if my memory serves me right, I believe Cameron ultimately concedes he shouldn't have included the critique to begin with. Ultimately, it's irrelevant to the debate's substance, so I'll move on to the actual start of the debate. Cam's Kalam.
Here it is. Premise 1, there is a first cause. Premise 2, if there is a first cause, then God exists. And the conclusion follows, God exists. One of the biggest reasons why I like this formulation of the Kalam is that it's short, it's clear, and it also makes the connection to God very, very explicit, as you can see. Moreover, if you notice, it doesn't involve a causal principle. It doesn't say that everything that begins to exist has a cause. It doesn't even argue that if the universe began to exist, then it has a cause. That doesn't show up in this formulation of the argument. All this one says is that there is a first cause, and then it basically identifies that first cause as God.
Cameron says his argument doesn't involve a causal principle, but I find this a bit misleading. It's true, neither premise affirms the truth of a causal principle. You can accept both premises and the conclusion and also consistently reject any causal principle. But an appeal to some causal principle is almost always used and maybe even necessary to support the argument. After all, if no causal principle is appealed to, what reason is there to prefer an uncaused God over an uncaused universe? I'll address this point more when it comes up later.
But looking back to my argument, we can see that it is actually logically valid. The conclusion does follow logically from the two previous premises. My argument, to get a little technical, follows the deductive form of modus ponens.
Cameron is correct that the argument is logically valid using modus ponens as its form.
Why think that there was a first cause? I take it as fairly obvious that if causal finitism is true, in other words, if every state or event has a finite causal history, then it follows that there is a first cause.
A lot of the debate deals with the truth of causal finitism. Every event or state has a finite causal history. In support of this, Cameron cites the Grim Reaper paradox.
Here's the Grim Reaper paradox. Fred has been condemned to death by an infinite number of Grim Reapers. So in this scenario, 1, Fred is alive at the beginning. 2, Fred can only die through the motion of a Grim Reaper's scythe. 3, unless they are in the act of killing Fred, the Reapers aren't moving. And 4, once dead, Fred stays dead. Grim Reaper number 1 is set to kill Fred if he's still alive at 1 a.m. Grim Reaper number 2 is set to kill Fred if he's still alive at 12:30 a.m. Grim Reaper number 3 will kill Fred if he's still alive at 12:15 a.m., and so on and so on. An infinite number of Grim Reapers are set to kill Fred as the clock gets closer and closer to midnight. Okay, so now here's our question. Does Fred survive this process? The obvious answer, the most obvious answer, is no. Fred will be killed by some Grim Reaper. After all, again, there are literally an infinite number on this scenario. There are an infinite number of Grim Reapers waiting to kill him. And here is where it gets really, really interesting. Which Grim Reaper killed Fred? The answer, paradoxically, is that no Grim Reaper killed Fred. For any Grim Reaper that we pick, there's already a prior Grim Reaper that would have already killed him. So for example, let's suppose that Grim Reaper number 1 killed Fred at 1 a.m. Well, on this scenario, that's actually impossible because Grim Reaper number 2 was set to kill Fred at 12:30 a.m. if he was still alive. This process can be repeated for any Grim Reaper. For any Grim Reaper that we select, there will always be another Grim Reaper that would have already killed him. And so it follows from this that no particular Grim Reaper killed Fred. So on this scenario, we know that Fred is dead, but we also know that Fred is not dead because it's impossible that any particular Grim Reaper killed him. Thus, we've arrived at an explicit contradiction. Fred is dead and Fred is not dead.
This paradox leads to an explicit contradiction, and obviously contradictions cannot be true. Fred is dead by 1 a.m. and Fred is not dead by 1 a.m. There's nothing incoherent about a finite number of Reapers coming to kill Fred, but the contradiction arises when we introduce the actual infinite, suggesting there's something about actual infinites that's responsible for the contradiction. There is a whole lot that could be said about the debate over infinity, but I've addressed some of those concerns in previous videos, and I have plans to address more of those concerns in a separate video, so I'll move to the next point.
But what about quantum physics?
Cameron rightly notes that despite the oddities of quantum mechanics, nothing about quantum mechanics suggests contradictions can somehow be real.
If you like logic like I do, here's a quick summary of my defense of this premise. Premise 4. The Grim Reaper scenario is impossible. And we just discussed why this premise is true. It gives us an explicit contradiction, and contradictions are impossible. Premise 5, if the Grim Reaper scenario is impossible, then causal finitism is true. We just discussed why this is true. What's impossible about the Grim Reaper scenario is the infinite set of killers. Make the series finite, and then the contradiction just vanishes. So it follows causal finitism is true from premises 4 and 5. Premise 7, if causal finitism is true, then there is a first cause. And remember, if every state has a finite causal history, there must be a first cause. So it follows there is a first cause.
Notice that Cameron's sub-argument doesn't deny that actual infinities can exist. They might. Again, what's denied is that a causal chain can contain an infinite number of causes. Cameron moves to support premise 2.
My primary argument in support of my second premise focuses our attention on the difference between the caused and the uncaused. Suppose that you were like walking or hiking through the forest one day with a friend of yours, buddy, and you come up on a green stone that's laying in the path. Your friend picks it up. He looks at you and he's like, Not a lot of people know this, but this is actually the only uncaused thing in the universe. Of course, this little random green stone that he picked up off the ground is not uncaused, but why?
My main question is, why what? There are no less than 3 questions Cameron could be asking here. First, he could be asking, why is it we don't believe our friend? Second, he could be getting us to ask ourselves, why do we believe stones have causes? And third, he could be asking, what is it that requires stones must have causes? Clearly, all these questions are related to one another, so I'm going to clarify how they're different and then respond accordingly. Let's start with the first question. Why, despite what our friend says, do we continue to think the stone has a cause? The most concise answer is simply that our friend's claim seems baseless. It's radically unlikely our friend would know this, even granting its truth. We have even more reason to be skeptical of our friend because of his later claim that some twig is the only uncaused thing in the universe. This has a boy who cried wolf effect that makes your friend seem totally unbelievable. Moving to the next question, why do we believe stones have causes? I've already given one answer, induction.
Well, other stones that we're familiar with, other branches have causes. So in all likelihood, this stone and this branch have a cause. This is called an inductive inference. And actually, I think this is a completely legitimate way of thinking.
As Cameron notes, this is pretty basic inductive reasoning.
The purpose of this story is to illustrate the point that you don't necessarily have to have prior experience of something to know that it has a cause.
You might be interested to note at this point, and this is where the clarity comes into play, that nothing I've just said helps in answering the third and last question, which Cameron says he ultimately wants to focus on.
Why can't that green stone that he picked up, or this branch, why can't those things exist without a cause?
This is a metaphysical question, one whose answer concerns the nature of reality itself. But the first 2 questions are questions of epistemology, how we come to know things. Another way of saying this is that clearly the explanation why the stone has a cause is not that every other object in my experience has had one. My experience only shows that I'm justified in thinking the stone has a cause. It doesn't provide any basis for or insights into the nature of causation. Similarly, experience justifies my inference that the sun will rise tomorrow without informing me why it will rise tomorrow. In philosophy, this is quite appropriately called the problem of induction. Now, what does all this have to do with the third question? Let me explain. Cameron says the point of the thought experiment is to show
that you don't necessarily have to have prior experience of something to know that it has a cause.
This is still in the realm of the second question, talking of how we come to know things. Exactly 10 seconds later, Cameron says,
here's my point. Even though this thing is very different from other things that we ordinarily experience, being very different is not a relevant difference between something that is caused and uncaused.
Given the distinction between metaphysics and epistemology, this statement could be taken in one of 2 ways. Cameron could be saying that metaphysically, something's having a cause or not having a cause is irrelevant to the way it differs from other objects. This would be relevant to the third question, but it can't possibly be what Cameron means. Otherwise, he couldn't claim later in the video that something's being limited is the relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused. Cameron must not be making a metaphysical claim, but rather an epistemological claim. A claim about what it's reasonable for us to believe. He must be claiming that something being very different from other experienced objects is not grounds for thinking it could be causeless. We still don't have an answer why the stone actually does require a cause, and this implies something interesting. If your inductive case is strong enough, and you have reason to accept causal finitism, then you can reasonably think there is a first cause, Cameron's first premise, without even specifying the conditions for a caused or uncaused being. But remember, Cameron's using this thought experiment to support the second premise. If there's a first cause, God exists. The point we're supposed to take from the thought experiment, like Cameron says, is that
being very different is not a relevant difference between something that is caused and uncaused.
But this statement can be understood metaphysically or epistemologically, and this ambiguity will lead to complications down the road. After concluding that difference in general cannot establish a thing might be uncaused, Cameron evaluates 4 specific features that might mark the difference between caused and uncaused things: shape, size, color, and power. None of these seem related to whether or not something has a cause, showing it might be hard to find the feature that is related. But Cameron has a suggestion, and I think this suggestion is what makes his version stand apart from other Kalam-type arguments. This is what's unique to Cam's Kalam.
My proposal, and this is where we're going to start to see the connection to God, is that the relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused is limits. Part of the reason why we think that rocks and branches and people and cars and mountains have causes is because they're limited in various ways. In general, limits have causes.
Given the murkiness, whether Cameron's claims are metaphysical or epistemological, this last statement basically opens up a Pandora's box of complications. And because of that, I am going to leave this episode here. Thank you very much for giving this episode a listen. Your support means the world to me. Remember, if you like the video and you want to see more, click subscribe and consider heading over to my Patreon. If you feel like you have anything to say, leave it in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.